When you picture the Middle Ages, you probably imagine castles, knights, or monks chanting in cold stone halls. But here's the question most people forget. How did they survive the freezing winters inside those walls? Believe it or not, some monasteries had a secret technology that could heat entire rooms from the floor up, a system so effective that it rivals modern central heating. In this story, we'll uncover how forgotten medieval engineers revived ancient Roman hypocausts, why monks relied on them, and why this ingenious idea eventually vanished again. Stay with me, because by the end, you may find yourself wondering whether our modern heating systems are really as advanced as we think. Chapter 1. The problem of cold in monastic life. When you imagine a medieval monastery, what comes to mind? Perhaps stone cloisters with arches that seem endless, long wooden tables where monks sit in silence, and candles flickering against walls, blackened by centuries of smoke. What you may not imagine, but what was far more pressing in their daily existence, was the relentless cold. Stone, after all, is a poor insulator. In Northern Europe especially, monasteries became not only places of prayer, but also laboratories of survival, where the daily confrontation with winter drove monks to experiment with unusual methods of warmth. Before we reach the invention of elaborate heating systems hidden under monastery floors, we must first understand the sheer difficulty of enduring winter in a life devoted to silence, routine, and discipline. Monks, unlike peasants, could not simply huddle around a smoky central hearth. Their rule, particularly the rule of Saint Benedict, which governed much of Western monastic life from the 6th century onward, called for silence, order, and moderation. A monastery was not a home in the cozy sense. It was designed to discipline the body as much as the soul, to strip away comforts so that the monk might focus on God. Cold was part of that discipline. Yet, while some endured it as ascetic suffering, others sought out practical ways to make their cloisters livable. You might wonder, how cold could it have been? Consider England, France, and Germany in the High Middle Ages. Winters were not necessarily harsher than today's, but buildings were vastly different. Stone walls absorbed dampness, thick but drafty doors let in freezing winds, and windows were covered in oiled parchment rather than glass until later centuries. A room might have a roaring fire, but the heat would be quickly swallowed by the walls, and smoke often lingered heavily. In this environment, monks carried out hours of chanting at dawn and dusk, copying manuscripts in scriptoria where their ink sometimes froze, and eating frugal meals in large refectories where breath turned visible in the air. Cold was not merely an inconvenience, it was a danger. Frostbite, chilblains, and pneumonia were common. For peasants who worked outdoors, the cold was an enemy they expected. For monks, whose vows demanded stillness, contemplation, and a strict rhythm of worship, cold was an intrusion into their spiritual routine. Imagine kneeling for an hour of prayer in an unheated church before sunrise in January. Imagine dipping a quill in frozen ink as the wind whistled through an unsealed slit window. The need for warmth was not luxury, but survival. At first, monasteries followed the simplest solutions. Fires and braziers could warm small rooms, though smoke posed constant hazards. In the communal refectory, large hearths were sometimes installed, but their warmth rarely reached more than a few feet. Some monks, particularly in northern regions, layered themselves in woolen habits, cloaks, and hoods, their garments patched again and again to survive the seasons. But there was a contradiction here. While the rule of Saint Benedict emphasized modesty and restraint, prolonged exposure to cold undermined health and productivity. A sick monk was of no use to the community. The balance between suffering and survival became a quiet but urgent problem. It is here that monasteries became centers of architectural experimentation. The very cloisters that strike us today as symbols of serenity were in fact engineered responses to a climate problem. The thick stone, The inward-facing courtyards and the covered walks all served to manage wind and limit exposure. Yet, the cold still seeped in. Slowly, monasteries began to look back to the Romans, whose ruins dotted the European landscape and whose technology still whispered from broken aqueducts and tiled floors. Among those technologies was the hypocaust, a system of underfloor heating that had warmed Roman villas, bathhouses, and public buildings centuries earlier. The rediscovery of the hypocaust was not immediate. For much of the early Middle Ages, the art of heating remained crude: hearths, fire pits, and piles of burning peat or wood. But by the 11th and 12th centuries, as monasteries grew wealthier and more organized, some began to experiment with reintroducing Roman ideas. Archaeological evidence shows that abbeys like Cluny in France and Hersau in Germany installed systems that circulated heat beneath their floors. Yet before diving into that revival, it is important to grasp why monasteries were uniquely suited to develop such systems. A monastery was more than a religious site. It was also a landholder, a manager of resources, a school, and in many ways, an engine of technological continuity in Europe. Monks oversaw workshops, studied texts, and kept alive fragments of knowledge that might otherwise have vanished. They also had access to labor, lay brothers and hired masons who could undertake ambitious construction projects. If the average peasant could not dream of underfloor heating, an abbey with wealth and discipline could. But this wealth was not spent frivolously. Each architectural choice was weighed against the ideals of monastic poverty and spiritual purity. To justify an elaborate heating system, monks had to frame it not as comfort, but as necessity for worship and scholarship. Warmth, they could argue, was not indulgence but a tool to preserve their bodies for God's service. What remains remarkable is not only that monks revived a Roman method, but also how they adapted it to their unique setting. Unlike villas designed for leisure, monastic hypocausts were often installed beneath scriptoria or chapter houses, the places where monks worked and read. They were not used to create luxurious baths, but to make the cold stone of daily discipline survivable. You can picture it. Below the floor, a fire tended by servants or lay brothers, its heat moving through a chamber of flues and tiles, rising gently into the floor above where monks bent over their manuscripts. To those accustomed to numb fingers and frozen breath, this must have felt miraculous. Yet before these systems spread widely, there was debate. Was it proper for monks, sworn to simplicity, to enjoy such warmth? Some abbots resisted, insisting that cold was a test of devotion. Others, more pragmatic, allowed heating in specific spaces but forbade it in dormitories, where sleep in the cold was seen as part of the spiritual struggle. These tensions highlight the paradox of medieval monasticism. It sought to deny the body while also requiring the body to function efficiently. The problem of cold, then, was not just a physical battle. It was a spiritual and philosophical one. Every stone laid, every fire lit, every choice to warm one room, but not another reflected a negotiation between survival and sanctity. The hypocaust was not simply a technical solution. It was a moral one, and so we arrive at the threshold of a remarkable development: the revival of underfloor heating in medieval monasteries. But how, exactly, did monks reconstruct a technology that had been largely forgotten since the fall of Rome? What did these systems look like, and how did they differ from their ancient predecessors? And perhaps more intriguingly, why did they fade into obscurity once again, leaving us to rediscover them only in ruins and records? Chapter 2. The Invention and Workings of Monastic Hypocausts. If you were to lift the stone floor of certain medieval monasteries, you would not find bare earth beneath. Instead, you might uncover an intricate system of chambers, vents, and tiles, evidence of a quiet but astonishing revival of Roman ingenuity. To understand how monks harnessed the hypocaust, we must descend beneath the cloister and look closely at the technology itself. its construction, and the daily routines that kept it alive. The word hypocaust comes from the Greek hypo, under, and caust, burnt or heated. The Romans had perfected it centuries earlier. Furnaces channeled heat through a crawl space below floors, which were raised on stone pillars called pilae. Hot air circulated upward through hollow bricks or wall flues, warming the entire room above. It was an elegant system, but one that demanded both careful design and a steady supply of fuel. After Rome's collapse, the knowledge of building such structures largely vanished in Western Europe. By the time Benedictine monasteries were being founded across France, Germany, and England, the hypocaust was not part of common architectural memory. And yet, the ruins of Roman villas and bathhouses still dotted the European landscape. A monk walking across a former Roman province might see rows of tile pillars exposed where walls had crumbled, or the remnants of a flue embedded in stone. These remnants were not always understood, but in certain regions, especially where contact with surviving classical texts was possible, the idea of heated floors never disappeared entirely. Monasteries, with their scriptoria full of copied manuscripts, were uniquely positioned to preserve not just theology, but fragments of practical knowledge. By the 11th and 12th centuries, when abbeys like Cluny had grown into vast complexes with international reputations, monks began adapting these principles. The Cluniac order, in particular, is associated with ambitious architectural projects. Excavations at Cluny have revealed underfloor systems. Beneath the calefactory, the one room where monks were officially permitted warmth. The calefactory, literally the warming house, became central to monastic life, a chamber where the community could thaw, copy manuscripts, or carry out essential tasks without risking frostbite. The hypocaust was its hidden engine. The basic design of a monastic hypocaust began with a furnace, usually built adjacent to the heated room. This furnace, tended by lay brothers or servants, burned wood or peat. The fire's heat entered a cavity beneath the floor, supported on small stone pillars. These cavities were deliberately shallow, often just a few feet high, creating a plenum through which hot air and smoke could circulate. Specially designed floor tiles, sometimes interlocking with grooves, spread the heat evenly. Flues built into the walls allowed smoke to escape upward, while also radiating warmth into the chamber. Archaeological studies show remarkable attention to detail. At Canterbury, for instance, remains of a hypocaust reveal that tiles had been carefully aligned to maximize heat distribution. At Hirsau Abbey in Germany, the system extended beneath several rooms, showing that monks were not merely copying Roman designs, but adapting them for communal spaces. These were not luxurious spas, but functional workshops of devotion. You can imagine the rhythm of life built around such a system. Each morning, before dawn prayers, a lay brother would stoke the furnace, shoveling in logs or peat blocks. The fire's heat would creep beneath the stones, slowly warming the chamber above. By the time monks filed in to copy text or hold chapter meetings, the floor radiated a steady, subtle warmth. It was not the blazing heat of a hearth. Rather, it was an enveloping, even temperature that could sustain long hours of work. For men accustomed to the numbing chill of stone cloisters, it must have felt like a miracle wrought by engineering rather than prayer. But hypocausts were not simple luxuries. They required enormous labor and resources. First, there was the building itself. Skilled masons and tile makers had to construct the underfloor chamber, ensuring that the stone pillars could bear the weight of monks and furniture above. Then there was fuel. A hypocaust consumed far more wood or peat than a single hearth, and monasteries had to manage forests or boglands carefully to sustain their fires. This necessity linked the hypocaust directly to the economy of monastic estates. Warmth, in other words, was not merely a technical matter, but an agricultural one. Without managed woodland, no heated floor could survive a winter. There was also the problem of maintenance. The underfloor cavity accumulated ash, soot, and debris, which had to be cleaned regularly. Servants crawled through narrow spaces, sweeping out residue and ensuring the system did not clog. Flues could crack, floors could sink, and furnaces needed constant repair. What strikes us as elegant was, in practice, a demanding machine of stone and fire. Despite these challenges, the hypocaust spread to numerous monasteries across Europe in the High Middle Ages. Some were modest, heating only the warming house. Others extended beneath scriptoria, infirmaries, or kitchens. Infirmaries were particularly important. Monks who fell ill were permitted warmth, and so hypocausts were justified as medical necessities rather than indulgences. In this sense, the system straddled both spiritual and practical arguments. It was not luxury but charity, not comfort but preservation of the community's health. The design also influenced monastic architecture in subtle ways. Rooms with hypocausts had to be raised on platforms, sometimes altering the symmetry of cloisters. Flues and chimneys became more common, reshaping the skyline of abbeys. Fire management became a daily ritual embedded in the rhythm of monastic service. The warming house was no longer just a chamber. It was a hub of communal survival, binding together technology, economy, and devotion. There is another fascinating dimension here: the cultural memory of Rome. By reviving hypocausts, monks were engaging consciously or not with the heritage of the empire that had once dominated Europe. The Middle Ages are often imagined as a time that rejected classical knowledge, but in the hypocaust we see a selective revival. Monks did not resurrect Roman aqueducts or amphitheaters, but they did reclaim a technology that met their immediate need. In a sense, the hypocaust became a bridge between antiquity and medieval life, reminding us that technological memory is rarely linear. It is patchwork, resurfacing where necessity demands, and yet, for all its ingenuity, the hypocaust remained limited. Few monasteries could afford the resources, and even fewer expanded it beyond a handful of rooms. Most of the monastery remained as cold as ever, with monks shivering in their dormitories and chapels. The hypocaust was thus both a triumph and a compromise, proof that warmth was possible, but also a reminder that comfort was restricted, controlled, and never absolute. If you close your eyes, you can imagine the contrasts, the bitter chill of a morning mass in a freezing church, followed by the quiet relief of entering the calefactory, where the floor radiated subtle heat. The monks' chants echoing in stone halls gave way to the hushed scratching of quills in a warmed chamber. The hypocaust did not erase cold from monastic life. It merely carved out islands of survival. But this raises a question. Why, if the hypocaust was so effective, did it not spread beyond monasteries? Why did peasants not adopt it for their cottages, or towns for their public halls? The answer lies partly in resources and partly in philosophy. Fuel and labor made the hypocaust unsustainable for ordinary households. But equally, the monastic setting provided a justification service to God that secular society could not replicate. For villagers, smoky hearths and peat fires remained the norm, while the hypocaust stayed hidden beneath cloisters, a secret of the religious elite. Still, the story of the monastic hypocaust does not end here. For even within monasteries, its survival was precarious. Fires could damage buildings, the cost of fuel could strain estates, and changing architectural fashions would eventually push the hypocaust aside. In time, it would vanish again from common use, remembered only in ruins and archaeological reports. But before we look at its decline, we must ask, what did it mean for monks to live with such a system? How did warmth change their daily routines, their health, and even their theology of suffering? Did heated floors subtly alter the meaning of asceticism, or were they absorbed without controversy into the rhythm of monastic life? Chapter 3: Decline, Replacement, and Forgotten Lessons of Monastic Heating. When we last stood inside the monastery's calefactory, we could feel the gentle warmth rising through stone floors, carrying with it echoes of Rome's ancient genius. For a moment, it might have seemed as though monks had solved the problem of cold forever. But as with so many medieval innovations, the story of the hypocaust is not one of triumph alone. It is instead a story of limits, of impermanence, and of the quiet ways in which even brilliant technologies fade back into obscurity. The decline of the monastic hypocaust did not happen all at once. For centuries, certain abbeys maintained their systems, stoking furnaces and crawling through underfloor chambers to clear ash. Archaeological evidence suggests they were still functioning in some monasteries as late as the 5th-10th century. Yet slowly and inexorably, they were replaced or abandoned. Why? The reasons lie in economics, architecture, and even theology first. There was the matter of cost. Heating an underfloor system demanded prodigious amounts of fuel. A single hypocaust, if operated daily, could consume more wood than a small village. Hearth might use in a week. For monasteries with extensive woodlands or access to peat bogs, this was manageable. But as populations grew and forests shrank under the pressure of medieval agriculture, fuel became a contested resource. The great abbeys were often landlords to surrounding peasants, and disputes over wood rights were common. Cutting down trees for heat risked angering tenants or diminishing long-term revenue. In this sense, the hypocaust carried an economic burden that was difficult to justify in lean years. Second, maintenance was relentless. Stone pillars beneath floors might crack. Flues required constant sweeping to prevent blockages. Floors sometimes sank or warped, creating dangerous structural weaknesses. While monasteries had the labor of lay brothers and masons, they also had to weigh the value of that labor. Was it better spent tending crops, repairing roofs, or preserving a machine of warmth that served only a few rooms? Increasingly, the answer was the former. Third, architectural change reshaped the priorities of abbeys. From the 13th century onward, Gothic architecture emphasized soaring height, large windows, and vast open spaces. These structures were stunning, but they were also notoriously difficult to heat. A hypocaust beneath a Gothic refectory would have been laughably inadequate. Instead, monasteries began relying on larger fireplaces, inserted into walls with extended chimneys to draw out smoke. The hearth, once central to the peasant cottage, now became a fixture of monastic and noble life alike. Unlike the hypocaust, the hearth was flexible, easier to maintain, and adaptable to new building styles. And then there was theology. Monastic ideals evolved across centuries, and with them, attitudes toward warmth. In the earlier Middle Ages, heating might be justified as necessary for study or health. But later reform movements within monasticism, such as the Cistercians, emphasized austerity to an even greater degree. Cistercian monasteries were famous for their strictness. They avoided elaborate decoration, shunned excess, and placed harsher limits on comforts. For them, the hypocaust might have seemed an indulgence, a relic of Cluniac excess that distracted from spiritual purity. Thus, the very movement of reform that revitalized monastic spirituality also helped extinguish one of its cleverest technologies. What remained then were fragments. Floors collapsed, flues filled with earth, and the knowledge of constructing hypocausts slipped back into silence. The warming houses they had once powered became ordinary rooms, sometimes refitted with fireplaces, sometimes left unheated altogether. By the time of the Renaissance, hypocausts were curiosities noticed by antiquarians when they stumbled upon Roman ruins, but rarely connected to the medieval revival beneath cloisters. The chain of transmission was broken again, and yet, even in their decline, hypocausts left traces on medieval life that are easy to overlook. The very idea of a warming house persisted long after the systems that fueled it disappeared. In some abbeys, the calefactory remained the one place where monks could gather to warm themselves by a later fireplace. The architectural precedent outlived the machinery. Similarly, the principle of channeling heat through stone and brick did not vanish entirely. It resurfaced in later centuries in the masonry stoves of Central Europe, in tiled heating systems in Russia, and even in early modern experiments with central heating. The hypocaust was forgotten, but its ghost lingered. For historians, what is striking is not simply that monasteries revived Roman heating, but that they abandoned it again. This cycle raises uncomfortable questions about how societies preserve or lose knowledge. We often imagine progress as linear, but the hypocaust reminds us that technologies can rise and fall depending not on their brilliance, but on their fit within culture, economy, and belief. A warm floor was possible in the 12th century, yet, for most people, it remained unattainable. The persistence of smoky hearths in peasant cottages was not ignorance, but adaptation to scarcity. The monks, for all their learning, were not immune to the same pressures. Think of this scene one last time. A monk in the 12th century sits in a warmed chamber, quills scratching on parchment, as heat rises invisibly from the floor beneath him. He is warmer than his ancestors, warmer than the peasants outside the abbey walls, warmer than his own brothers chanting in a freezing choir. The system that makes this possible is ingenious but fragile, a machine dependent on forests, stone, and labor. Within a few centuries, it will crumble, and the monk's successors will shiver once more, quills freezing, candles flickering in. Drafts, comfort is temporary. Cold returns. What does this forgotten story teach us today? Perhaps it reminds us that even our modern furnaces and radiators are not immune to history. They too depend on resources: oil, gas, electricity, that might one day become scarce or contested. They too are machines requiring maintenance, vulnerable to the rise and fall of societies. The hypocaust beneath the cloister whispers a lesson of humility. That warmth, however ingenious, is never permanent. And so, when we marvel at the fact that medieval monks once walked on heated floors, we should also ask, what does it mean that they chose or were forced to let that warmth slip away? Did the loss of hypocausts signal a retreat from Roman memory, or was it simply the natural adjustment of a community balancing survival against devotion? The question lingers as open as the smoke hole of a medieval hearth. If such knowledge could vanish once, what might we lose again in the centuries to come? Thank you for spending this quiet time with me here on Quiet Boring Sleep. I hope this little journey through forgotten history helped you drift into calm or simply gave you a moment of peace. If you'd like more slow, soothing stories like this, please remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these quiet histories alive. Until next time, rest well, and may your sleep be deep and undisturbed.